Good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Wrongly Convicted Unsolved Edition. I'm your host, Brigid, and in this week's episode, we will be taking a look at the case of Robert Baltovich and his connection with the Elizabeth Bain murder of 1990, or lack thereof. It all began in the early summer of 1990 on June 19th, when Elizabeth Bain, a young woman and student at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, went missing. Prior to her disappearance, Elizabeth had told her parents that she was going to check the tennis schedules at her school, the University of Toronto Scarborough. Worried that Elizabeth hadn't returned home, her mother, Julita Bain, called the Scarborough police at 6:45 a.m. the next morning and reported her missing. 2 days prior to Elizabeth's disappearance, a witness told the police that they had heard the couple having a verbal argument on the street. On June 19th, at around 5:30 p.m., Elizabeth was seen with a blonde man. Baltovich's sister-in-law would later testify that she saw Robert at his home during this time. It wasn't until 6:20 p.m. later that evening that a jogger saw Elizabeth's car parked next to a nearby wooded area. Baltovich, concerned about Elizabeth's whereabouts, sees her car with the windows open, but is unable to locate her. He headed to the gym, where he stayed until 8:45 p.m. and went to pick Elizabeth up from her class, which ended at 9 p.m. When he went to pick her up, she was nowhere to be found, so he headed back to the gym and stayed there for a couple more hours until 10:30 p.m. 2 days after her disappearance, on June 21st, 1990, Elizabeth's car, a silver 1981 Toyota Tercel, was found parked outside of an auto body shop not far from her home, roughly about 1 kilometer away. Bloodstains were found on the back seat of the vehicle, which, through forensic testing, crime scene investigators were able to determine it to be that of Elizabeth. She was murdered. But the question still remained: how and who? The police began interviewing friends, family members, and potential witnesses. On June 24th, Detective Sergeant Steve Reeser and Brian Raybould began questioning Baltovich for several hours. During the questioning, there were 10 discrepancies found in his version of events, according to Detective Sergeant Steve Reeser. Baltovich was considered to be a potential suspect in the murder of Elizabeth Bain and was put under surveillance. The police developed a theory that Robert Baltovich had killed Elizabeth and hid her body in a secluded wooded area of Colonel Danforth Park. 3 days following, the police believed that Robert retrieved Elizabeth's body from the original location and disposed of it in the lake. This explanation explained why Elizabeth's body was nowhere to be found. The forensic evidence of the blood stains found inside of Elizabeth's car did not support this theory. During the summer of 1990, the hypnotically enhanced memory method was used amongst witnesses who had seen Elizabeth or Robert prior to Elizabeth's disappearance. Witnesses experienced hypnosis prior to being questioned on their recollection of events. On July 11th, 1990, which was the date of what would have been Elizabeth's 23rd birthday, her parents, Julita and Ricardo Bain, spoke to the press outside of their home in Toronto. They pleaded for the return of their daughter and for the abductor to come forward. Not long after, Baltovich's home was searched for clues and his car was impounded. The public, fearing for their safety, and the police, desperate for answers, began to look at Robert Baltovich with tunnel vision. 5 months after Elizabeth Bain had originally disappeared, Robert Baltovich was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Robert's trial began on February 4th, 1992. He took the stand in front of Justice John O'Driscoll. It was here where the prosecution argued that Elizabeth had attempted to break up with Robert, who had proceeded to kill her in a jealous rage. The prosecution further argued that Robert's alleged reason for murdering Elizabeth Bain was due to his belief that if he could not have her, nobody would. Of core importance to the Crown's case was the testimony of two witnesses, Mary Ann Purrs and David Dibben, whose testimonies would become vital in the eventual exoneration of Robert Baltovich. In court, Mary Ann stated that she had seen Robert and Elizabeth sitting with one another at a picnic table on campus at 5:40 p.m. on the day of Elizabeth's disappearance. Robert, however, stated that he was at his residence during the time of the murder, which a number of his family members confirmed to be true. David, on the other hand, testified against Baltovich, saying that he had seen him driving Elizabeth's car on June 22nd. The jury believed the statements of both witnesses. However, they were not aware of the method by which these statements were obtained, and even fabricated. At the outset, Mary Ann only had a fuzzy recollection of the man who she saw with Elizabeth on the night of the disappearance. It was only after reading an article in the Toronto Sun that had included a photo of Baltovich as a potential suspect and speaking to members of Elizabeth's family who believed that Baltovich was guilty that Mary Ann started to believe that he was the man she saw. Shortly after, Mary Ann underwent hypnosis, which, uncoincidentally, led to Mary Ann having a much sharper vision of what she had witnessed, or so she thought. These new memories heavily implicated Baltovich in a way that had not been present before the hypnosis. Following each of these events, Mary Ann then picked out Robert's photo from a photo lineup. A second witness, David Dibben, initially testified that he had seen Robert in Elizabeth's car, though he claimed he wasn't really paying attention at the time of the alleged sighting, specifically stating that he did not have a good view of the driver. Originally, David described the driver, whose described appearance was not representative of the way that Robert looked at the time of the crime. As the police proceedings moved on, David's description evolved. As a result of the testimonies of these two witnesses, the jury found Robert guilty of the second-degree murder of Elizabeth Bain on the 31st of March, 1992, and was sentenced to life in prison without the eligibility for parole for the next 17 years. To this very day, Elizabeth's real killer has not been brought to justice. Paul Bernardo, the Scarborough rapist, however, is likely the killer. During the 4 years prior to Elizabeth's disappearance, a series of brutal attacks, rapes, and murders were committed by an unknown person in the Scarborough area. Given the location of the crime and the time period, evidence strongly suggests that Paul Bernardo is a guilty suspect. Before Elizabeth disappeared, the last known sexual assault committed by the Scarborough rapist took place only 3 weeks before Elizabeth had vanished. On November 3rd, 1995, Bernardo was declared to be a dangerous offender and was identified as the Scarborough rapist, as his attacks all occurred in the area of the University of Toronto Scarborough and Elizabeth's home. James Lockyer, a lawyer for Innocence Canada, represented Robert during the appeal process and strongly believes that the killer was Paul Bernardo. Robert, knowing the truth that he had not harmed Elizabeth, appealed his conviction, believing his time spent in prison would be short and that the truth would reveal itself. After 8 years of waiting, Robert, during the winter of 1999, made a phone call to James Lockyer, asking for his help. This is what changed Robert's life forever. It was after this phone call that Innocence Canada took Robert's case with the main priority of getting him, an innocent man, out of prison. On March 31st, 2000, Robert was granted bail while the hearing of his appeal was pending. Robert was released from jail 8 years after he was wrongfully convicted of the murder of Elizabeth Bain. When Innocence Canada took on Robert's case, the organization found several problems with the court proceedings, as well as multiple examples of judicial malpractice. Firstly, the judge had instructed the jury members in such a way as to undermine the importance of Robert's case, while emphasizing the Crown's case. Proper etiquette would have been for the judge to use a more neutral approach, rather than revealing personal biases, which would inevitably influence the jury. The judge did not include any cautionary statements regarding the reliability of the eyewitness testimonies. This was particularly problematic due to the aforementioned use of hypnosis on the eyewitnesses. As a result, the jury likely placed much importance on this evidence. Innocence Canada also argued that this eyewitness evidence should not have been included in the first place due to the fact that it was derived from hypnosis, which has been known to affect memory. So there is a high potential for some of the details brought forth to have been completely fabricated. The Ontario Court of Appeal was made aware of these problems in the case and agreed that Robert received an unfair trial. The court made several comments that were critical of the judge, stating that the trial was unfair and unbalanced, that it contained significant errors of law, and unduly promoted the case for the Crown and effectively ignored and denigrated the case for the defense. The court even went as far as to say that the judge's tone and improper use of rhetorical questions left little doubt as to where he stood. He believed that Robert was guilty and did not hide it. Robert did not receive a fair and balanced charge and was therefore denied his right under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to receive a fair trial. And finally, the court agreed with Innocence Canada that the trial judge had not given the jury adequate instructions with respect to the eyewitness identification evidence of the two key witnesses. It was noted by the court that both key witnesses' descriptions of the individual whom they believed to be Robert had remained inconsistent over time, and that their initial descriptions of the suspect did not even match the appearance of Robert. During the trial, it had been ignored that David did not get a good look at the individual who was driving Elizabeth's car, and that Marianne had viewed a photo of Robert in the Toronto Sun newspaper, as well as spoke to family members of Elizabeth who had believed the potential killer was Robert, all of which would go on to influence Marianne's memory of what she did in fact see. Later, when Marianne was shown a photo array of potential suspects, she was shown several photos at once, as opposed to a sequential lineup, leading her to choose a photo that she thought was the best fit. In addition, one of the officers told Marianne that Robert's photo was in the lineup. Proper practice involves lineups that are conducted by members of the force who do not have access to this information. Once again, none of these details were brought forth to the jury. Finally, a third witness, Suzanne Nadon, had testified that she had seen a woman whom she thought could possibly have been Elizabeth through the trees at night. Like Marianne, Suzanne's memory became clearer after undergoing hypnosis. This would be key in the dismantling of the Crown's case. The Supreme Court of Canada released their stance on the use of hypnosis in a case called R.V. Trochim, 2007. It was held that going forward, eyewitness evidence derived post-hypnosis would not be admissible in court. The decision of the Supreme Court to not allow hypnosis was so strong that they withheld eyewitnesses from testifying, even if their testimonies remained the same as prior to being hypnotized. At Robert's retrial, Marianne Purse and Suzanne Nadon were both unable to testify as a result. Innocence Canada argued that Robert should be allowed to bring forth evidence of Paul Bernardo's crimes to explain the likelihood of his involvement in Elizabeth's murder, to which they were successful in doing. On April 22, 2008, the prosecution chose to call no evidence at Robert's retrial. The Crown agreed that there were no real case against Robert, calling no evidence. After spending 18 years trying to clear his name, Robert Baltovich was finally acquitted.